welcome to Conversation in International Relations. I'm Dr. Cristian Nitoiu from the Center for Foreign Policy and Security Studies. Today, we are joined by Richard Sakwa. He is a professor at the University of Kent, and he has written extensively on Russian foreign policy, Russia's domestic politics, and more recently, he has focused on various changes in the world order with the focus on non-European powers such as China or the BRIC states or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So, Richard, many analysts currently would argue that we have entered a new Cold War. Would you agree with this statement?
Yes and no, to be always taking the middle path. To the degree of yes, we could say that certain patterns of Cold War politics have come back in two particular formats. One in institutional framework. Obviously, NATO is back as a central security body, acting as it used to, as a collective security body on the European continent, because obviously there'd been many plans and much talk after the end of the Cold War for new architecture, for a bigger role for the OSCE and all the rest, or even genuine shift to more civilian forms with the Council of Europe, obviously the European Union. But in institutional terms, NATO looked for a new role in the world after the end of the Cold War, and it's now back to the original one, which is indeed to keep Russia out. But also the second aspect of the Cold War back, ideological. Not in the old forms, obviously it's not communism versus capitalism or anything like that, but sharp ideological division, accompanied by propaganda, so-called nowadays the language of fake news, the language of disinformation and all of that, plus this endless talk of spying and subversion and so on. So to that point, I would go along with Bob Legvold in his excellent book on New Cold War, in which he talks, it's not the return of the Cold War, but it is a Cold War. So, but on the other side, I still think that the idea of a Cold War is anachronistic and misleading, because it assumes that it's still Eurocentric, it's still or Atlantic system-centric. In fact, what's going on is far, far bigger. As far as Russia is concerned, it's not anything like the Soviet Union. It's not setting up an alternative modernity. The game is much bigger. Of course, the original Cold War was global in certain respects, but focused on the Atlantic framework and with the Soviet Union. But today, it's a different world, and the constellation of power is different. And what we're witnessing is the emergence of a post-Western world. We're witnessing the emergence of a post-Atlantic world in which there are new bodies, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS. The Chinese have now finally, after many years of quietly rising, taking a greater global leadership, indeed a leadership of globalization itself. And in all of this, yes, there's a Russia-China alignment. There are plenty of asymmetries in that relationship, yet a fundamental sense that they're on the same side. It's not a league of autocracies. It's a league of countries which simply will not accept a subordinate place in the US-led liberal international order. The US-led liberal international order delivered enormous public goods, and it can still do so, but its pretensions to be the only order in the world simply is unacceptable. That is the big conflict which we see today, and if you're going to call it a new Cold War, then you're missing almost everything that's important about it.
Right. So in this kind of new constellation that you argue is not really a new Cold War, do you think we as academics or analysts should still look primarily at the relations between Russia and the West?
No. I actually begin to think that what we should be looking at is questioning what is the West itself. The West is a term which developed in the Cold War. So if we're going to use the term the West, we're actually perpetuating the ideology which was at the heart of the Cold War, that in certain sense the West At that stage, yes, it was a very complex phenomenon, but it still was representing, and the West became obviously expanded to include Japan, South Korea, and many other states. But it was a sort of a position which was defending a certain way of life, liberal or other values, democracy, and so on, which was hugely important in all of this. Yet the West today, with all of it, and one of the good things of the West is always its self-doubt, its questioning, its such like. What we see after the end of the Cold War is that the West, as it were, became radicalized. It became, they claim, in a sense, the West or the liberal international order became coterminous. And of course, it's multi-layer, and one of those layers is as a military system, a power system. A power system is a value system as well, of course. So it's not simply the West itself, I think, needs to be accepted that it is no longer an adequate term to describe a more multi-dimensional, what the Russians would call polycentric or multipolar world. Because China and others, if you're talking about the West, you're assuming that a set of values which belong to the West, those values which are now embedded in what we could call the secondary institutions of international society, United Nations, for example, issues like, in particular, legal and other economic governance. But let's talk even simply about environmental issues. Global change, climate change, is one of the biggest challenges facing humanity. And those issues don't belong to the West, to anybody else. We now need to find cooperative solutions at the level of international society, and in which it's not Russia against the West or anybody like this. It also privileges the West. Russia ultimately had ambitions to join this changed West. It now understands the West will not change as long as it is dominated by a power system which is centered not in Europe but the other side of the Atlantic, and therefore it is anachronistic. And even in the United States, it is now defecting from the West which it used to lead because it's inadequate to deal with its own challenges. So, no, I don't accept that framework.
Okay. Well, in the past, you've written quite a lot about the fact that the post-Cold War period was characterized by a sort of cold peace between, let's say, the West, although you don't really agree with this term, and Russia.
The Atlantic system, I'd say.
Right. So do you think that actually relations, let's say, between the United States or the European Union and Russia can, in practice, actually go beyond the cold peace?
Yes. I argued that from 1989 to 2014, we had 25 years, a quarter century of the Cold Peace, in which none of the fundamental questions, not just of European security, but even sort of big ideological questions or big ideational questions, a vision of the future, how do we move to a cooperative, really dismantle the institutions and the ideology of the original Cold War, which itself was if you like, a manifestation and a crystallization of a long-term split in the West, or if the European system itself, of emancipatory socialism against a different model of social organization. So all of that in 1989, and I think a lot of this debate, Fukuyama and all the rest, made important contributions to all of this. But ultimately, because the old thinking dominated, the new political thinking, as Gorbachev and his colleagues would say, was never allowed to thrive, and different visions of European order were never allowed to become institutionalized in new ways of new organizations and thinking. In 2014, and it's between 2012 and 14, we moved out from the Cold War to Cold Peace to a new epoch of contestation and confrontation. So I'd say the Cold Peace is already over. It's gone. We're now into a far hotter phase. We hope that it won't turn into a super hot phase of armed conflict, but it cannot be excluded. We're living in, as you know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have pushed the doomsday clock to a closer point to midnight, in other words, to Armageddon, than it was at any time in the Cold War. So it's, there was one moment when Soviet Union exploded a hydrogen bomb, which was about equivalent. But it's been, one of the most dangerous moments. So we're living in that. So we need to understand that we need, as it were, more contestation about all of this. And so the worst thing is all this is happening and very little social and political debate about the times we're living in. Instead, by calling it the New Cold War, we simply, as it were, we understand it. But what we need to do is to move to a new type of understanding, and scholars, as you say, need to take a big part in that. And unfortunately, I think that, and also society, civil society, if you want to use the term, needs to become more active. In the past, there was active peace movements and all of this. And now, of course, in the age of individualism and consumerism and postmodern identity politics, it's very hard to mobilize against these old-fashioned issues of war and peace.
Right. Let me challenge you a bit now. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the Pentagon released last year in 2017, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, a sort of military index that it used to publish almost every year during the Cold War of the kind of military capabilities that various states around the world have. And it published that kind of evaluation of the Russian and Chinese military capabilities. At the same time, if you look at Russian public narrative and the kind of debates and public discourse, you notice that there is a sort of securitization of the West always being seen as some sort of perpetual enemy of trying to destroy Russia. And I would make an argument that actually it suits both various interest groups in Russia as well as in the US or the European Union to portray Russia in, let's say, the West or the European Union or the United States as the enemy in Russia. So would you agree with this statement?
Yeah. Again, yes and no. Yes, to the point that undoubtedly in this new epoch of confrontation and conflict, both sides feed on each other. And there is absolutely no shortage of crazes in Moscow, just as in Washington and London. So no question about it. And indeed, there's been the mobilization of the mass media in the image of the enemy and all of that. However, on the no part of it, I would say, the no part would be ultimately to say, I talk a lot with these people, and ultimately, the West isn't even that important for Russia. I actually think what has happened, and what I don't think people in the Atlantic system really understand, is that they were concerned, and all of this was until about 2012, 2014. After Ukraine, so many people have said, we now understand. We can't deal with you people. You're always arrogant, you start wars, you start conflict, you blunder about the world, you destroy regimes in Libya and Syria and Iraq and so on. There's just no dealing with you guys. And so it isn't that important. We want to talk to more civilized, more peaceful people who have a genuine vision of a better world. Let's talk to the Chinese and the Indians and the Filipinos and the Indonesians and so on. European Union, we won't turn our back. We are ready to talk. We'll engage when we can. But, ultimately, of course, you're powerful. We recognize that the United States is by far the most powerful country in the world. The fact that the Pentagon has returned to that, of course, we've seen then their new nuclear strategy and so on, has explicitly declared that Russia and China are revisionist powers bent to change the world. Again, this is a sort of inadequate thinking which dominates the Pentagon and dominates Washington, because Russia is not a revisionist power. China is not a revisionist power, neither are. They are challenging simply the West's claim to be synonymous with universal order. They say, no, we will not accept that order as subalterns, as weaklings. Yes, we've benefited from it. Russia and China have benefited enormously. Russia is now a capitalist country which wants to be integrated into the global economic system. But this global economic system does not belong to Washington. And, Cristian, what is even more interesting, even the European Union is beginning to understand the dangers. What is, it's awful, but at the same time, welcome as far as I'm concerned, is that what Beijing and Moscow have seen in that sort of arrogant behavior. Yeah. Now Brussels and the European Union, over the the JCPOA agreement, Iran nuclear deal, even the European Union has suddenly understood that it can be suborned, bullied, and its concerns, Angela Merkel, all those others kept saying to Donald Trump, stick to that deal, and they didn't. So it's, I'm afraid, even the European Union finds itself in the same boat.
Right. Let's go back to the world order. One of your main claims is that the liberal world order is not the only game in town.
Yeah.
Right? But, you know, to be honest, a question that sometimes keeps me up at night is what kind of alternative to the world order can, let's say, China or Russia actually create an alternative that would be distinct from the liberal world order and most importantly viable?
Yeah.
Do you have any views
Yes,
on
I
that?
do. The liberal world order is a multi-level order. It's a set of normative values and such like which suited, and actually suited many others as well, the interests of American capitalism and American state. And after the Second World War, if you will know that the United States, when it was rising, it was very protectionist power. It developed its steel and other industries under major tariff barriers. After 1945, the United States emerged as, about half the world's economic capacity. So after 1945, it suited it to have free trade, remove barriers and such like, and of course it learnt from the terrible protectionism, Hoots-Smalley, what's it called, in 1930 in response to the Wall Street crash. So yeah, it then opened up all this stuff, and as it happened, it opened up decades of huge economic development and very positive. I mean, who's saying not? But this again is, this now, as the world evolves, these issues, let's call it globalization, does not belong to the United States. It is now everybody has got a stake in it. So what is the alternative vision of world order? It is genuine subordination to those institutions of world order, many of which were created by that order itself. We're talking about United Nations, we're talking about WTO, which is now being, sanctions is against every single rule in the book. And the United States has now got 35 major regimes of sanction against various states. It's repudiating, in other words, the system which it was instrumental in creating. And the liberal international order was always also a power system. And that power system centered on Washington. Sometimes it used that power responsibly. Sometimes it used it irresponsibly. The war in Vietnam is obviously irresponsible. The illegal invasion of the Anglo-Americans of Iraq in 2003 was irresponsible. The destruction of the Libyan state in 2011 was irresponsible. So if that is the world order, which you say is the only game in town, then I think even if Russia and China don't represent an alternative, then it really has to be invented pretty soon to keep that liberal power system in check. Not to destroy it. I'm never saying that. And also, let's stick to those principles now, which of the United Nations, which China and Russia now co-constitutors of it. It doesn't belong to the West or the Atlantic system. It belongs to all of humanity. And let all of humanity, it doesn't mean to say that there won't be major problems to solve about democratic inclusion, liberal rights, and so on. They don't belong to the West. The Chinese have been talking about these issues for 2,000 years, the legalists versus the Confucians. Yeah. These values of human dignity can be manifested in many different ways, including the particularity, and any system which says that the ideas generated amongst a hip community, say of New York, left bank, and what have you, are universal to be imposed on Ghanaian women. We want the dignity of Ghanaian women, but they're not going to take the same form as people living in postmodern New York.
So, Richard, we'll finish off with a question about Romania and its role in the current new constellation, as you call it, of the world order. So what would be, in your view, Romania's main foreign policy priority? How should it adapt to this new constellation?
Well, I mean, if I was a leader of Romania, I'd certainly disinvite our American friends from the ABM missile installation, which is not far from Craiova, where we speak today. I think it's a catastrophic mistake. I also think it's a catastrophic mistake they're building this in Poland as well first. So that's it. I think that Romania should become a responsible stakeholder, as to use the neoliberal language, in an order, and it should then understand that, let us call it small to medium powers like Romania, should instead of, their commitment, it seems to me, too often, is to the Atlantic system rather than to Europe itself. And Romania, I think, with its tremendous culture and its vibrant intellectual life and so on, it could play a part in re-energizing the European vision and the pan-European, because Romania has a long legacy of engagement with Southeast Europe and the larger region and so on. So instead of being simply a marginal element of a larger system, and if we can really think about a pan-European idea, then suddenly, instead of being at the edge, as we were talking about the world at the edge, suddenly Romania becomes the world at the center. All of it does. Romania, Hungary, Poland. Suddenly, instead of being torn between Eurasia on the one side and European Union, they suddenly become, but they have to have a positive vision. And it's no good simply kowtowing to the Atlantic power system. It really has to move beyond that, and that also means a cultural shift. Instead of looking back to the period of the past and so on, it should actually use its own unique historical experience as a gift, if you like, to that new European vision, which of course is a global vision, because if it was only European, it would be too small.
But actually, I think an emerging views in small states like Romania or other post-Soviet states is that these kind of countries can't really afford not to choose to go either with Russia or the United States. So, and you're saying there can be some sort of middle ground. But what would actually be the cost of that? Do you think that countries like Ukraine in practice could do that?
Well, let's leave Ukraine to one side for a minute. But the cost is high at the moment because the incentive structure is the way it's been formed. And that the incentive structure today is designed to keep Romania marginalized and quiet and simply a loyal ally. It's even more subordinate today than it was in the days of Ceausescu and when Romania had its own independent policy working with France and de Gaulle and so on. So, but I'd say more, that the costs are very high, even for a major power like Italy. But sooner or later, it will come. So you might as well do it now rather than later, because the existing system is leading to conflict, and it's no good Romania being one of those still fighting the Cold War, still living in the language of resentment and anger about its humiliations and defeats of the past. The whole point of the European Union was to have a new and positive agenda, and I'd love to see Italy and I'd love to see Romania begin to reforge an identity, not into this old-fashioned populism of Hungary and Poland, but a more forward-looking vision.
Right. But going back to Ukraine and making a parallel to Ukraine, if Romania were to actually distance itself from this kind of transatlantic community or stronghold, as you may want to call it, wouldn't Romania face maybe a similar response from the United States as Ukraine faced from Russia when it tried to get out of Russia's sphere of interest, let's put it like that?
Well, the thing is, Ukraine, Ukraine was quite open to engage. What happened, of course, as you know, there was forced regime change and through a revolution, which had huge geopolitical implications. Obviously the Sevastopol naval base and so on. This doesn't mean to say that Ukraine couldn't have changed its rulers, and it needed to even. But there was a deal. I mean, this is what was the issue. On the, as you know, the 20th of February 21st, the deal was there for pre-term elections. Yanukovych would have gone. Instead of which, we know that on the Maidan, because we've got the thing when Victoria Nuland was actually talking about who would take over in Kiev. So, any state, if on the border, but no one is talking about regime change in Romania at this stage. But yes, in other words, to that degree, the Cold War is back in that there is bloc discipline. an attempt to that any defection is punished, and it'll be very high. We're not saying that Romania or any country should unilaterally jump. It should start a dialogue, start a debate about widening the parameters of the security issues facing the continent.
Sure. Well, thank you, Richard. I think you provided a lot of food for thought, and we thank you for this.
Thank you. My pleasure.